Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of our virtual conference series. My name is Jose Ortiz. I'm the CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. Thank you for being here with us. The New York City Employment and Training Coalition supports the workforce development community to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, and that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. NYCETC's membership is composed of nearly 180 workforce providers, education institutions, and labor management organizations that provide job training and employment services to nearly 600,000 New Yorkers, making us the largest city-based workforce development coalition in the country. A special thank you to JPMorgan Chase, Verizon, Google, and all of our sponsors supporting NYCETC Conference Series. And thank you again to Wes Moore and Maria Torres-Springer for being here with us this morning. We're going to just take a second to introduce you to our speakers. Wes Moore is the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, one of the largest anti-poverty forces in the nation. Wes grew up in Baltimore and the Bronx, where he was raised by a single mom. He graduated from Valley Forge Military College in 1998 and Johns Hopkins University in 2001. He later attended Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar in 2004. Wes then served as a captain and paratrooper with the United States Army's 82nd Airborne, including a combat deployment to Afghanistan. He later served as a White House Fellow to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. He is the author of 4 best-selling books, including The Other Wes Moore, a perennial New York Times bestseller, capturing the nation's attention on the fine line between success and failure in our communities and in ourselves. Before becoming the CEO at Robin Hood, Wes was the founder and CEO at Bridge Edu, an innovative tech platform addressing the college completion and job placement crisis, where he remains chairman of the board of directors. He has also worked in finance as an investment banker with Deutsche Bank in London and with Citigroup in New York. Wes's proudest accomplishments are his 2 children with his wife, Dawn. Maria Torres-Springer is the vice president for U.S. programs, where she oversees the foundation's domestic programming for civic engagement in government, creativity and free expression, just cities and regions, technology and society, the future of workers, and gender, racial, and ethnic justice. Previously, Maria spent almost 15 years in public service with the city of New York. She has led 3 agencies with over 3,000 employees and approximately $2 billion in annual operating budgets, addressing some of the city's most significant public policy challenges. Throughout her tenure in government, she worked to create powerful partnerships among communities, businesses, and the agencies she has led in pursuit of expanded economic opportunity for all New Yorkers. Maria served as commissioner of the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, was the commissioner of the New York City Department of Small Business Services, and was the first woman to serve as president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Maria earned her bachelor's degree in ethics, politics, and economics from Yale University, and has a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Today, she lives in Brooklyn with her husband and 2 daughters. Wes and Maria, welcome. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you both for joining us.
The honor is all ours.
Thanks so much. Ours. Well, let's get started. Wednesday was an historic day on a number of fronts. We inaugurated Joe Biden as the 46th president of the United States. We inaugurated Kamala Harris, the 49th person to the office of vice president, and also the first woman and first person of color to serve in the role. Tell us about the significance of that moment for you. I'll start with Maria.
Thank you, Joey, and fantastic to be on this panel, to be with Wes. The moment, given all that we have experienced over the course of the last year, was a moment full of emotion. It marked, for me, a period where I hope we are turning the page. And so it was a day of optimism and hope, full stop. And of course, there was still sadness, because as we speak, there are thousands of people who are continuing to pass because of the global pandemic that we are in. And if you look at the course of the last 10 months, in New York City alone, it's as if 9/11 in terms of mass casualties happened every month. And so I say these 2 things because we have been living in a time of great convulsion, at a time of enormous contradiction. And we must keep all of those forces, those emotions, those motivations, as we think about the enormous and incredibly important work that lies ahead for all of us, despite what was an unadulterated, of course, day of renewal and hope and upliftment just a few days ago.
Yeah.
Wes?
It was well, and first I just want to say what an honor it is to be with you, Maria, and your work and your impact is so significant, and Jose, you are truly one of the finest leaders I have had the pleasure of being around and working with. I mean, the work that you all do is not just important, but in this moment it's been imperative. So to the chance to be with both of you, in this time, it means a lot. So thank you for the invitation. And Maria, everything you said was so spot on. I mean, there was the power of the moment, right? There was the power of the fact that we actually heard a leader using words like hope and using words like together, like a better tomorrow, with not a drop of cynicism. There was no punchline coming. And there was something really powerful about that. There was something really powerful about the fact that, I was, and I actually put on social, I was proud of the fact that we watched our first female vice president, our first woman of color, being able to ascend to that role, and how important it was, not just for my daughter to see it, but how important it was for my son to see it. We saw history being made in a very beautiful and a very powerful way. But there's also more to that than just that too. We saw literally on day one how movements and changes that were making our country better happen literally on day one, where we saw, executive orders that said that the United States was going to rejoin the WHO. We saw executive orders that said the United States was going to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. We saw executive orders that said that we were going to stop construction on a wall. We saw executive orders that said we were going to lift and reverse this idea of a Muslim ban. So literally in the first hours, we got a sense of the fact that we have a new path that we have got to plot. So it was both in the ceremonial, but it was also, even if you just look at the 17 executive orders that were done on day one. If you look at the fact that, within hours of being sworn in, we had our first female vice president swear in an African-American liberation preacher from Georgia, a 32-year-old Jewish man, and a first-generation Latino from Southern California, all to be US senators. Just that day, you realize how much, not just that we had to do to unearth, but also it gave us a real sense of momentum about the things we could actually get done together going forward.
And I have to, all of that completely agree with, and I just have to give a shout out, of course, to the incredibly inspiring and just dazzling poem by Amanda Gorman, and everything that she did and what she stood for. And I swear to God, we're all going to work for her one day, and I look forward to that day. But it was a moment that I think, in her person and in her words, I have to believe renews hope. And so the symbolism and the substance in all that we do, and I know we're going to get into what inclusive recovery means for our city and for our country. Both those things are important. And doesn't mean it's not an insignificant amount of work, but it's on all of our shoulders to carry on those avenues of change.
Yeah, and you both alluded to, obviously, the importance and why, after so much that we've experienced, particularly over the last year. And, I want to reference one of the other reasons why January 20th was an historic day was that it was also the 1-year anniversary of the first person to be diagnosed with COVID-19 in this country. And so, we experienced dramatic change over the last year. Millions lost their jobs, 400,000 plus Americans and counting have lost their lives. So I want to ask a specific question really about your organizations and how did you activate and aid in the initial economic recovery and health effort, and tell us what strategies have you adopted over the last 10 months that are producing good positive results. Wes, you want to go first?
Okay. Yes. I mean, we closed our offices relatively early. Really by March 3rd, our offices were closed, and I think no one expected for the tail on this thing to last as long as it's lasted. But the thing that we knew going into this was that the communities that we thought would get hit first and hardest got hit first and hardest. And so very quickly by mid-March, we had already, reactivated our relief fund, and this is only the third time in the history of Robinhood's 32-year-old history that we've reactivated this fund. Once was after September 11th, the other was after Superstorm Sandy. And since then, we've really deployed now, north of $65 million, and that's across 800 grants to over 600 nonprofits who were really on the front lines of the pandemic. And the thing that we, noticed as we started, both working with community, working with other partners, such as, Ford and many others, was there are three areas that really we had to drill into quickest, because that's where we saw the greatest pullback, and that's where we saw we could have the greatest amount of impact. One was just really about how are we prioritizing and supporting survival services like the food pantries and the health clinics, the mental health programs, the benefits access programs, eviction prevention services. And it's really about how are we then advocating on local and state and federal level for different policies that could better affect people. The second was really about how are we supporting virtual education and work experience programs to support youth aging out of foster care, people involved in the justice system. And the other big thing is how are we focusing on getting cash in the hands of people that need it most? Basic cash assistance. And the thread behind all three of those different elements, truthfully, was it served as a distinct reminder that the policies that we had, the speed of the policies that we had, and how amazingly miserly the policies we had in place, how many people they were leaving behind. Because when we started focusing on things like cash assistance, it was very clear to us that the people who are going to need the greatest and the most direct levels of cash assistance were the people who in many ways were just intentionally left out of the conversation when it came to things like the CARES Act. So for example, if you were undocumented, even if you were working and paying taxes, there was no cash assistance for you. If you were part of a mixed status household, there was no cash assistance for you. If you were working but not making enough money to hit the income filing threshold, i.e. the working poor, there was no cash assistance for you. And so really we just started thinking about and started zeroing our efforts on saying, what are the things that we could have a direct and a distinct and a speedy impact on? And that's not just helping to fill in the holes that are completely unequal and uneven policies we're putting in place. But then how do we also then use our voice to be able to address the fact that these policies were incredibly unequal and incredibly miserly at a time when our communities needed it most?
On our end, we too were probably one of the first organizations to go remote in the spring of last year. And, I'd say that moment, the last several months, what we've experienced really demanded for us as an institution. The moment begged us to do a bunch of things differently, to do better, to do things faster, to do things more simply. Because as I mentioned, I know we're talking a lot about what an economic recovery must look like, but the crisis, and a lot of ink has been spilled on this, but it's absolutely true. I mean, in just talking about New York City, it was an economic crisis like the 70s and like the Great Recession. It was also a natural disaster like Sandy. It was also a mass casualty event like 9/11. And also an emotionally and has been traumatizing event like 9/11. and of course the racial justice uprisings over the summer. So I mention all of that because those became the motivations for how we, in the middle of last year and continue to this day, really needed to step back and say, what is the best role for us to play? And that has taken a few forms. I'll mention a few. One is to, in the middle of last year, we issued $1 billion worth of social bonds, which essentially allows us to double our payout. And a significant portion of the early phase of that $1 billion, we deployed in order to fortify social justice, racial justice grantees across the country. With the real acknowledgement that without the work of these types of organizations, so much was going to be lost, and that they are already under-resourced in good times. And with the pandemic, many were facing an existential, potentially extinction event. The second, with a lot of partnership with amazing foundations and organizations in New York, including the Robin Hood Foundation, investments in direct relief, largely through collaborations, both for social services and for the arts. And I want to take a moment here to say that many sectors, of course, decimated, arts and culture in New York City in particular, and so vital, not just to the life of the city, but to our economic recovery moving forward. So a not insignificant amount of resources to make sure that we were doing what we needed to do to help fortify that sector. The third thing that I'll mention that I also think is, there's so much. I remember when the lockdown started in the spring of last year, and a number of workers were conveniently reclassified as essential. And they, while the rest of us sheltered at home, kept going to work, kept our economy in New York City and other economies across the country running. And for many months, handmade signs were made. There was a lot of applause at 7 p.m. at night, and all of that is beautiful. But make no mistake about it, recognition, that applause does not equal power, does not equal the types of changes that are needed to protect workers at large. And so that too has been a major focus of ours in New York City and certainly across the country, to really think about what it means to protect our workers, to think about wages and benefits, their voice and their agency, so that they are essential every day, versus just during times of the pandemic. And we do what we need to do in order to make sure that they continue to be safe on a very basic level, but also have the types of standards of living that this pandemic, and I know we use the word laid bare probably too often, but the pandemic has, and all of the crises, has really lifted the veneer of how deep the inequities in our systems are in this city and across the country. And, I really just do hope we can all continue to make those types of investments and those types of changes that are critical, so that what we don't do is stand back up the system before the lockdowns, because clearly that system never really worked.
Yeah, you're talking about something that has become obviously an increasing part of our discussion on a local, national level, and it's really similar phrase to what the president has recently talked about in terms of building back better, and because obviously the past for many folks was a truly unstable future, and so going back to that is not necessarily what we want to do moving forward. So talk through, what is your near-term, long-term vision for aiding in an inclusive economic recovery? And when thinking about that, and we've already both started to allude to that a little bit in terms of your recent investments, tell us a little bit where talent development and the future work fits into that discussion.
I can, I'll start first. I actually, in addition to, and piggybacking on what Maria was just saying about, how it showed it both exposed and exacerbated the issues that have always existed when it comes to communities of color, when it comes to Black and Latinx New Yorkers and beyond, when it comes to the gender gap, when it comes to show how homophobic and xenophobic many of our policies and these disparities actually are. It also exposed, frankly, for us, the fact that every single one of us own a complicity in it. That this is not just about what government should do better or that the policies are broken. Government should be better and the policies have been broken. Right. Yes. But we all own complicity on this. Philanthropy, the private sector, nonprofit sector, every drop of society has to own their measurements, where even I think about the things that we did during this time and during this crisis. And people say, well, isn't it great that you all, stood up and started focusing on cash assistance? Or isn't it great that we, you put out more capital than you normally put out? Or isn't it great that I'll talk a little bit about, one of the initiatives that we pulled together, which I'm incredibly proud that, Jose, you're part of, the Power Fund. But then it does ask a fundamental question. Why weren't we doing that in the first place? Right? Why did it take that for us to be able to really expose the realities of the things that we had the power to do something on, but we weren't? The fact that we watched how COVID-19 did have a completely disparate impact in our communities. Well, yes, it impacted everybody, but it did not impact everybody equally, either in terms of, rates of infection nor death rates. And that statistic has remained consistent. We did see in the summer of last year that, yes, policing reform is necessary in all communities, but it's just interesting that in communities of color, it becomes incredibly pressing. And this has become something that has been a generational problem that has not been fixed. We see the fact that race is one of the most reliable predictors of all life outcomes. And that includes everything from health and wealth to educational attainment, maternal mortality. And so I part of the thing when we talk about what does it mean to create, an inclusive economic recovery, it does mean how are we both bringing up the fact that many of these gaps that we have here, these are because of systemic challenges. It is a powerful thing that people that we now can at least, many of us at least can come to this understanding that systemic racism is a real thing. That the racial wealth gap, for example, that we have in this country, which is a little over 10-to-1, a racial wealth gap, is not because one family worked 10 times harder, right? Is that we've had systems that have continued to compound what that gap looks like. That doesn't just have historical context of things like redlining and discriminatory lending and that type of thing, but that have very current day implications and very current day policies that are continuing to make that real. Things like the appraisal gaps on properties. Right. So these are all things that we have to do from a policy perspective, but also I think about it from, the way we even think about our funding, where, for the past, over the past decade, we have watched a 400% increase in philanthropic giving. Right. And over that same period of time, and if you look at it, stretch it out over the past 20 years, a little less than 10% of all philanthropic dollars have gone to organizations that are actually led by people of color. Right. 400% increase, same period of time, a little less than 10% to organizations that are led by people of color. And so, when I think about the work of things like the Power Fund, which again, we're incredibly proud that Jose and not only you are part of it, but the organization is now a part of it. It really goes back to this question of not only did that disparity in our own portfolio, in the portfolio of philanthropy as a whole, not only did it show that there are systemically biased and racist elements in the way that we were thinking about our own funding, the reality is it also didn't make sense if you're actually trying to solve the problem. Where, in a city like New York, where 80% of those in poverty are people of color, we know that poverty fighting solutions that don't account for the conflating impacts of economic justice and racial injustice will just consistently fall short. And we want people who don't just come from, but also significantly represent impacted communities to be the ones who are not just at the table, but leading the charge. And so it's about how can you support not just the organizations, but support the leaders. And, and I'll just say that when People talk about, well, it's great that you all got these leaders now involved in the Robinhood portfolio and that type of thing. My honest gut reaction back after that is, I just don't know why they weren't there in the first place, because our organization has fundamentally gotten better because of the Power Fund, and will continue to get better because of the Power Fund and all these other, all the individuals and all the other organizations that are now part of our fold that should have been there a long time ago.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just say hats off to the two of you for your work on the Power Fund. I think it certainly, I think, encapsulates so much of how philanthropy must change and needs to change. Because as you mentioned, Wes, for sure, we are so many systems, philanthropy as a sector, a lot of philanthropists, a lot of organizations complicit in the systems that we ostensibly are here to take down and to dismantle. And so the question for us, so it starts there, it starts with that realization. And there's a fork in the road. Either there's a lot of finger pointing and hand wringing, or there are changes that are made in our institutions, not just in who we fund, but how we fund, that gets us closer to actually meeting the needs, not just short term, but over the long run, of the communities, of course, that we want to serve. Darren talks a lot about how the shift, at least part of the shift, to the specific question of what is the role of how we think about philanthropy in an inclusive recovery, and given all that we're facing, and this was even before the pandemic, but what it means to think about this as a practice not of generosity, right, but a practice of justice. And if that is the shift from generosity to justice, then one of the things it should compel us to do is to address what are the underlying causes of that injustice, what are the underlying causes of inequality, rather than just the symptoms, of course, of those problems, and just address those symptoms through charity. And so, for us, it is much of what I discussed before in the what we fund, but the how is so important. And the how means, at least, and there's a long way to go here, providing unrestricted funding. It means providing long-term funding. It means trying to staunch the starvation cycle that too many philanthropic institutions put grantees through. It means ending the practice of thinking about not-for-profit organizations as contractors, and that's either through government or from philanthropy, and really operating more in a system of trust that allows extraordinary leaders like yourself, Jose, and others spend less time dealing with us and more time with the work on the ground that is so crucial. To just 30 seconds on your specific question on talent and an inclusive recovery, incredibly important. Thinking about who the work that we do, recovery plan. The word recovery sometimes can take on a neutral meaning, but we all know that it is not neutral, that there are choices that are made by policymakers, by people who have power, and there are winners and losers in those decisions. And so when we think about an inclusive recovery, it is, I think, we often ask ourselves, how are we going to reset? How are we going to recover as a city? Of course, an important question. But for me, the more important question is, who are we going to reset for? And you start there. And if we are clear-eyed about that answer, then I think that leads us to a whole slate of ideas about what talent development, what training should look like. Hopefully, of course, building on the great work of many of the members of your organization. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. But what we do have to do, I think, is not just think that the old playbooks apply, given all that is new and different, or old and continually hard about the challenges that we face in the city. So talent, workforce development, thinking about how the people of New York can access opportunities, all of that deserves as much resources and energy and rigor as possible. And I think we have to ask ourselves the tough questions of are our programs truly reaching and serving those who have been hardest hit by the pandemic and who are too often the least likely to benefit even in times of prosperity.
Yeah, I want to touch on that a bit more, and thank you for both of your answers. I think one of the things that has been focused on over the course of the recovery effort, or at least the kind of early days in the triage effort, were a number of the different supportive services areas, which we all know in the workforce development community and talent development sector are vitally important for people to be able to not just work, but for them to be able to learn, right? And I think the pandemic just kind of further unpacked that reality. Those are things like childcare, food assistance, housing affordability, and of course, access to quality, good technology like broadband and computers, which was a major issue for so many folks within our community who were, had to remain home and needed to now learn virtually versus being in person, and do so simultaneously while taking care of a loved one or a child. So where do you see that fitting in philanthropy in the future as we start to think about regrowing the workforce, retooling the workforce, retraining folks? Where does the importance of these services fit into your strategies or your thinking generally moving forward? And Maria, if you don't mind going first this time.
Sure. Well, of course, we saw, as we do in the aftermath of any disaster, the social service sector stepping up on behalf of communities across the city. It has happened time and time again. It certainly happened last year and continues to. And so the support that we have provided, and so many other different institutions, specifically to help fortify a number of organizations doing work in housing, doing work in education, critically important. I worry, and I worry for a few reasons. I worry because in a time when budgets are constrained, city and state, and hopefully, of course, there will be federal stimulus dollars that mitigates some of those losses. But we still face in the city and state, huge budget gaps that the sector will suffer. And it will suffer because of those financial issues, but that it will also suffer because of the work can be siloed, right? And I totally get it. There's the social service sector, and then within the social service sector are particular organizations and coalitions and tables, each of which doing incredible work. And yet it too often becomes a zero-sum game. And so I think one of the ways philanthropy in general can help, in addition to, of course, resourcing as many of those institutions as we can, really create the type of table or the type of conversation that allows the social service sector kind of more writ large to be seen as the important partners that they are in any recovery agenda. So there's also a policy discussion that I think really needs to happen. So it's not just fighting over crumbs, whether those are philanthropic dollars or government dollars. And of course, the government dollars will dwarf any philanthropic dollars that are available. The second thing that I think is really important, again, we've been able to kind of lift the veneer in ways that I hope are transformational. If you think about the care infrastructure, the care economy of this city, or really of this country, for too long, the individuals, the people who care for our children, who care for the elderly, obviously mostly women of color, have not received the type of policy attention, certainly in terms of wages and benefits, that they deserve. And yet the city would have buckled to its knees had these individuals in this part of the workforce right, not been healthy and active and come to work every day through the pandemic. And so I mentioned this particular sector of social services, the care sector, as one that I think it is our both moral and economic responsibility to make sure that as we emerge from this pandemic, that the respect and the policy action that's needed in order to protect these workers is something that we all focus on, even if we're each kind of wearing our hats in different parts of the sector.
Thanks, Maria.
I think that's, it's absolutely spot on. And it's a really important question, because I think what it's also forcing all of us to do is both figure out ways that we are going to address the right now, but also ways we are almost being future predictors as to how we have to think about this. I mean, because one thing that happened is we saw how the damage of the right now hit so quickly. And it was because, frankly, of the fact that we were not able to do a better job or prepare for a future, or prepare for what kind of a setback that we eventually could have as a large society. I mean, we saw how, there were 11 years of job growth that went away in 11 weeks. Mm-hmm. I mean, the speed of what we saw and the severity, particularly when it came to exactly as Mary was talking about, the specific economies. When you're looking at hospitality, you're looking at things like hospitals and restaurants, et cetera. Oftentimes, these were also the places that were hiring many of the, low wage, first-time workers, individual, people of color, et cetera, who got hit so quickly with this. We also saw the fact that, how many people were just now newly without insurance. And it's because, and just literally praying not to get sick, by the way, in the middle of a global pandemic, because we knew that we still had that healthcare piece that was still so closely tied to employment, and the fact that we still have benefit access in many ways still closely tied to employment in our society, which is a whole nother conversation. We saw how even when we looked at what happened within education, we all knew about the summer learning loss and what happens during the summer months to children if we're not able to provide summer supports, and how it could take until November to catch up to where they left off in June. What if a child hasn't been in the classroom since March? And what if we still have children who do not have reliable internet access? Or what if, even if we're asking the questions we were asking in the early days, was things like asking families, do you have a device? It's an irrelevant question if I have 4 children. So these are the things that we almost had to play a measure of catch up. And so part of it is we have to do the important future thinking that is going to take place. But we also knew that, that the recovery was going to be, much more both in short term and long term than about, jobs. And not every job is enough to put food on the table to pay rent because of things like childcare and food assistance. And so, and some of the ways that, we had thought about it and went through the process of it. If you take, just take those two, food assistance, for example, if you gauge the state of the economic recovery from COVID-19, you just have to look to food insecurity. And now, the city is in a full-blown food crisis and hunger crisis right now. The pandemic has caused so much food insecurity, that we watched it's doubling the impact on the amount of people who are food insecure. That's around 2 million people in the city. And so if you look at even what we had for our relief fund, just in our relief fund, about $10 million of grants have gone just to emergency food. And that's to about 120 organizations and partner groups who are, distributing and repurposing excess restaurant food, exploring pilots. How do you have, with bargain grocery stores, coming up with different type of ways and creative type of ways that we could address this thing that just became this exploding crisis right before our eyes. We have one initiative where it's, it was really working with hundreds of community fridges that have popped up, run almost exclusively, to Maria's point, by young women who are keeping them decorated and stocked with food. The childcare issue, that we've seen where you have, parents of color who are oftentimes overrepresented as essential, frontline occupations, and has created this massive gap in childcare services. And so if you look at some of the work we've done around our Fund for Early Learning, it's really working to transform the city's into an early learning, metropolis by investing in some groundbreaking and evidence-based initiatives. but it really is about how we had to, almost like push those different elements and things we fund, like All Our Kin, to really rebuild the equity and the opportunity that's been largely absent, even prior to COVID-19. And so this basic infrastructure building that took place around things like food insecurity, childcare, healthcare, health insurance, the educational gaps and divides. You're absolutely right, Jose. That really became for, especially for all of our organizations who really had a focus on sustainable economic mobility in terms of the way that we looked at our work. We saw that while our goal didn't change of really providing sustainable economic mobility for all families, what happened was the goalpost moved. And it just showed that we just had to put in other elements on those key levers to be able to support that.
So we're going to move into the last question, and just, if it's 30 to 60 seconds, and then we're going to move, offer an opportunity for a few of our guests to ask a couple of questions. So just in the near future, or the next 10 years, let's say, and that can, obviously it's a huge span of time, what is one thing that needs to change at the public policy level that philanthropy theoretically could support in helping to kind of move forward, and really trying to think about that question in terms of workforce or talent development? And anyone who wants to go first.
It's a great question, and in 30 seconds, I think there is an enormous road to travel to truly come to grips with how systemic racism has impeded, from a public policy perspective, the ability of programs that are all under the banner of training or workforce to reach and help, and not just in a one-time way, but in a more durable way, the people of this city who most truly need the assistance and are, of course, an incredible, there is untapped human potential there. And so, and you could do that not just in workforce, you could do it across a number of policy areas. And so the more philanthropy and government, but not just those sectors, the business sector and the rest of civil society can find the right spaces to really tackle some of these underlying issues and really confront where racial injustice has impeded our ability to move as quickly and as effectively as we can for different communities of the city. That is painstaking work and hard work, can't be done by just one sector, can't be done in one mayoral cycle, for sure. But that, until we really tackle those issues, a lot of what we do will be good, but we will not be prepared for the next set of crises, whatever contour they may take, if they're not addressed.
Amen. And in the 30 seconds, I would also say we have to make sure that we have philanthropy and the public sector and public dollars that are coordinated and working together. That philanthropy can really be measures of risk capital and innovative capital that are really providing important pilots for how government should also be rethinking itself, because they are the biggest pot of money. I think we have to do a better job of starting early. I think we have to, really focusing on things like how are we coming up with innovative, platforms such as everything from equity bonds to adjustments to the child tax credit. How are we coming up with ways of thinking about of reframing family leave, of reframing, childcare and childcare supports. If we can start early to be able to make sure we're giving children a better beginning and a better start, that we are providing better supports for their parents to be able to work and be able to provide better supports for the things they can do with their family, it is going to have it'll have the longest standing and the longest lasting impact on the way I think we're going to think about these next 10 years.
Thank you both. We're going to take a couple questions from some of our guests, and we see that there are a lot of questions, but obviously time can only afford a few of them. Our first question is going to actually come from Kate Mackin. Kate is the grants officer at the door. Kate, whenever you're ready, and it's going to take a little second for her to be pulled in. So give me a moment. There she is. Kate, whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you all so much. I wanted to ask for both of all three of your thoughts on how you see workforce training programs shifting to meet the demand of the economy and how that's going to look post-pandemic. And also if there are particular pathways that you see as being the most viable in the years ahead.
Actually, Jose, you should take that first.
I'll jump in, but I want to obviously, and then we'll maybe move on to another question. But I think that it was already alluded in terms of the impact of the crisis on the industries, all industries, in fact. And I think what essentially happened was the future of work and all the predictions and all the research that we had seen over the next 10 years. Around transformation of jobs and/or automation of specific jobs essentially happened overnight. And so instead of us having 10 years to prepare for that, the lights went out and jobs were lost, and many of them are simply not going to come back, or we're going to have to reimagine what that looks like. So we certainly have to think about ways to get people back to work in the areas that they feel confident that they are trained to do so. But we also have to think about what future employment looks like and career tracks look like, and not simply jobs. So we're thinking about green jobs and climate and resilient positions. The tech sector, of course. Healthcare is massive, and the idea of COVID testers before was never something that we would actually have to imagine, right? But now we have to think about those specific roles in the healthcare sector. The building trades will continue to be important, particularly as you connect that to the climate jobs that will be coming online. And we're happy to see that at the state level, the governor is supporting that effort. But there are a number of other areas that we need to kind of drill down and really expand our efforts as a workforce development sector in order to get people back to work. But we do need, as you mentioned before, so many of the supportive services that are required in order to make sure that people have the foundation that's necessary for them to actually begin even taking a quality and effective job training program, the digital literacy, broadband, et cetera. So Mary Mitchell is up. We're gonna actually take Mary's next question. Mary is the Executive Director of the Manhattan Staten Island Area Health Education Center. Mary, you're up.
Thank you so much. And thank you for knowing what AHEC stood for. I appreciate that so much. I'm so pleased to see you and meet you, Wes, as well. My question has to do with, of course, the healthcare workforce and the fact that we are actually losing people tremendously. And I haven't heard a lot of discussion about this. Being an organization that works for healthcare development, especially, and working with increasing diversity, I wonder if there's any philanthropic concern or others that are considering what we can do to replenish that pipeline, replenish the workforce, and if there's any consideration given to that, to funding in that particular area, or other strategies that we might employ.
Yeah, I can go first, Mary. It's great to see you, and it's a really important and a great question. We've actually put a real amount of funding, actually specifically in that area, in terms of how can we think about the rebuilding of of a healthcare force, because also it's both the data that we've seen on the short term. It's also showing the fact that we had a shortage even before COVID-19 that we had not addressed, and then it takes on the tertiary point of the fact that we're very concerned about the impact, the mental health impacts, that we think we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what 2020 and the mental health impacts of 2020, what that's going to mean for the workforce going forward. And so we've already started putting together a good amount of funding along those lines, because there has to be a real pipeline of replenishing. Part of that also is going to mean two different things. One is, how are we coming up with better measures and elements of support for our healthcare systems and our healthcare workers. And that includes everything from how are we thinking about student debt and student loans, and to better incentivize people to be able to go into the field and stay within the field. It also means how are we actually bringing it down a level and even 2 levels when it comes to pipelining. Are we working with everything from our secondary and our post-secondary schools? Are we coming up with incentives for people to be able to look into a pipeline occupation at an earlier point? And so this moment, one of the things I have a great level of optimism for is this actually gives us potentially the greatest chance to rethink educational platforms and pipelining that we have had in 3 different generations, right? This is our moment. And so thinking about that and how we can get more people into that field is, I think, the way that we've been spending our time and energy and our resources, thinking both in the short term, but also in the long term as well. We'd be loving to work with you and talk with you about some of the work we're doing and some ideas we had. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I would love that. Would love that.
We're going to take our next question. Our next question is from John Spooner. John is the founder of Stacks and Jewels. John, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hey, thank you very much. I basically wanted to build on what Maria Torres-Springer was saying earlier about unrestricted funding, and really I'm trying to figure out, how does a nonprofit build a relationship with a funder that can, the amount of trust that has to be kind of exchanged between the nonprofit and the funder has to be pretty significant in order to broach unrestricted funding as an idea and as a concept. And I'm just wondering, is that just a factor of time? You just work, and over time they build trust in the organization and like what you've done and see your impact, and that's when unrestricted funding can become available? Or are there other metrics? Are there other levels of transparency that could accelerate that relationship building to where unrestricted funding is an opportunity?
These are such good questions. I'll take a stab at this. And I'll also say that it breaks my heart that not-for-profit organizations, leaders of have to worry about this, because actually I think that these questions need to be answered by philanthropy. We need to change a lot of there was a question in the chat, kind of how we fund. That is a matter, as I mentioned before, of making it as unrestricted as possible, not just for a particular project, and you have to keep coming back each year. It has to be long-term. It has to be based on trust. Now, the good news, and I'm under no illusion that every funder can or is doing this. I am heartened by the fact that the pandemic, I've seen a lot of funders change how they work. Some of it's from necessity because things had to be made simpler, and others, and there were several hundred who joined, a pledge that we started to circulate. They're doing it and are seeing how it actually makes them better partners. And so it starts with the philanthropic sector needs to change so that these questions of what does it mean for a not-for-profit organization to receive this type of funding, they become easy. It's just like the way to do it. I know that's not an overnight endeavor. And so in the meantime, all of the work that a lot of not-for-profits are doing, and leaders of not-for-profits, to make that work more visible, to build the relationships, to make sure you're not chasing funding, but being very clear about what it is you are trying to do, and finding of other partners in that work, of course, should continue. But I look forward to the day, and we spend a lot of time trying to encourage our fellow travelers in philanthropy to reset ourselves, because every sector needs to do so as we try to tackle the challenges that we face.
We're going to take 2 more questions, and our next question is from Greg Morris. Greg Morris is the Executive Director of the Stanley M. Isaacs Neighborhood Center. and a board member of NYCETC. Greg?
Sure. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this moment. Thank you, first and foremost, nature my question. Thank you both to the panelists for being, for communicating the importance of the work of the human services sector, social services at this moment in time, and also being aware of and relentless about communicating the gap and the failure of our city government to step forward at the moment to support the sector that not just addresses the needs of vulnerable or fragile communities, but also is the sector that employs folks of color and supports communities of color, especially Black and brown women. So my question really is this: can the foundation world, could the two of you step up in this moment and try to bring together folks from the social services sector, from labor, from the private sector, from education, et cetera? Can you come up with, potentially by convening, can you come up with a framework for recovery? Because I don't think our city government has demonstrated its ability to do so. And I worry, because we're in an election cycle, that it's going to take too much time for this city to be able to get back on its feet in a way that is just and equitable. I think both of you have a point of view about this. I think you have the power to convene folks to think about this. And I would think that your ability to draw folks together could create a framework that could get us moving in the right direction for the folks who, again, to have a just and equitable recovery.
I can take it first. First, your question is absolutely spot on. It is, we have had a fundamental breakdown where on every single element and piece that we're all working on, where we've had that breakdown. And so every single one of us are going to have a part and a component and a voice to be able to ensure what that fundamental buildup is going to look like. And there actually are, gatherings and groupings that both we know are taking place, and some of which that we're a part of, that are bringing people together and talking about these things. And so I do think we are starting to see a measure of coordination and collaboration that we just did not see before, which is actually really exciting and really engaging. We're now working, frankly, I think about, us as an organization who hasn't always had the reputation of working well with others. And the truth is that is a core part of how we're thinking about this work going forward, because you cannot do this stuff on your own. You do not have the power nor the capital to be able to think you are going to solve any of these challenges on your own. And so I do think we're seeing that now. The one push that I would say as well is that we also cannot do this if the government is not at the table. We have to have them there. I think about you take something like just education, right? Let's take education as just one example where, we could collaborate, and I could, get with, Maria and the team and other foundations, say, let's put together a 25, a 50, a $75 million thing that's going to go towards education. And people would say that's fantastic, and they'd applaud it. We might even get a write-up in a newspaper about it. The reality is this: the budget for the DOE in New York City alone is around $27 billion. They need to be at the table. Part of our job is to make sure we're coordinating with them and pushing and prodding and introducing data, introducing information, that type of thing, because that is going to be absolutely crucial. But to be clear, part of the reason we have the holes that we have is not because philanthropy hasn't done its job, or the private sector hasn't done its job, or whatever, or nonprofits haven't done their job. It's because we're working against bad policies. So we need policies to change. In addition to that, the budget and the bully pulpit of the city, of the state, of local municipalities, and the feds is going to be crucial in order for us to get to where we need to get to. And so having them at the table and making sure that we can make the tables big enough and broad enough for even them to be there, I think is also a crucial component to it.
We're going to move into the last question, Maria, from Celeste, and then we're going to close out the questions for the day and move into our breakout sessions, and thank Maria and Wes for being here. But Celeste, you're up.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Celeste Fry of Public Works Partners. Hi, Maria.
Hi, Celeste.
So nice to see you both, and thank you. And Wes, I just really want to amplify what you said. I've spent my career trying to get government and the nonprofit sector to work together, and I know you both have as well. So my question is around digital literacy. I know what we have seen in this pandemic, even more than we saw in the previous years, is the digitization of entry-level and low-income jobs that are not actually tech jobs. And we're not seeing the investment in helping low-income workers gain the needed digital skills. Can you speak to any potential policies or work in that area? Thank you.
I'm happy to start. Thank you, Celeste. Really good to see you. It's a really good question. I think it's one of those questions that was probably always important, but certainly our experience in the pandemic makes a question like that one that needs to be answered, and it cannot be taken for granted. And I think as part of how we need to think about, to an earlier question, like what are the sectors that where we should invest, both as a sector and certainly the people who comprise the sector. So in my opinion, looking at digital literacy as a kind of a baseline, like the foundation for education and talent development across whatever sectors turn out to be the ones that we invest in. Some of these sectors, you know, as Jose mentioned, we should invest in because given everything that we know in the pandemic, we are positioned to quote unquote thrive in these sectors because we have to, whether it's healthcare, technology, advanced manufacturing, logistics, construction. And then there are those sectors that have been turned upside down, for which there will also need to be a reset, whether it's retail or hospitality or arts and education. And so while Ford in and of itself, like digital literacy in and of itself is not an area that we fund, I happen to think it's incredibly important in order to lift the baseline of what currently low-wage workers, the types of jobs that are available to them. But the second piece of that, which is I think you always have to talk about them at the same time and make investments and policy decisions on both the education, training, digital literacy, and then there's, of course, broadband access and broadband equity. And the more we are as a sector or as formations of people from different sectors are able to talk about what the entire system needs, I think that the more likely it is we're actually going to be able to implement and advance a recovery that is not piecemeal, but is one that actually lifts up the communities that we intend to serve.
Yeah, thank you both so much. We are run over a bit of time, so my apologies, but we really do appreciate your commitment, not just to being here today, but to the city of New York and all that you do. Your foundations are incredible. They're foundational in every aspect of the word, and we rely on you, and we really appreciate your time. So thank you for being here with us. Wes Moore, Maria Torres-Springer, we're going to say goodbye. We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great being with you. Thank you.